You can hear me? All right, great. Um, Good morning. Welcome to our first Let's Talk. Um, oh, we can't. Can you hear me now? Okay. All right, great. Welcome to our first Let's Talk series. Um, we decided to start having this series of very short, hopefully conversational and informative discussions around ethics and integrity issues because we heard from a number of the employees that it, in many cases, you just don't know what to do in a practical situation around an ethics issue, or that you'll read about things in the news and nobody really ever discusses it at work and you don't know what happened. So that there just needs to be a lot more conversation and a lot more discussion about how we behave in the workplace in an ethical manner. Um, so we thought we'd try to do this. These will be short, 15, 17 minutes, hopefully conversational. Afterwards, you can send questions. We'll get you answers. This first one, we're going to talk about some of the higher profile fraud cases that have been in the news lately and discuss those and hopefully give some practical tips to employees to make sure you don't find yourself ever in that kind of a situation. Um, with me today, I have Kisa Smith at the end. Kisa is our Deputy Director for Children and Families. Dawn Staley. Dawn is the Deputy Director for Health Care and also for our State Medicaid Director. Jim Brader is our, what's your formal title?
Chief Deputy Counsel.
Chief Deputy Counsel. He runs the office, he runs OC, the Office of Chief Counsel. And Jim is here because he's also our Chief Ethics Officer. And many employees don't realize that we do have an Office of Ethics and a Chief Ethics Officer here. All right, so we're going to do this, as I said, as a conversation. I'm going to try to moderate, and hopefully this will be informative. So first, Dawn and Jim, there has been a lot in the news lately about in the mental health area, particularly about a large mental health provider in the state, former employees here, vendors. Can you talk a little bit about what went on so that we can have a discussion around it?
We have had a situation where we had a large provider who had numerous sites within the state and serving thousands of beneficiaries was suspended based on a credible allegation of fraud following an investigation by the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit within the Attorney General's Office and the Office of Medicaid Inspector General. And again, I won't go into all the technical details, but basically what happened was you had the provider that was suspended because they found a way to bill for services for which individuals enrolled in Medicaid were not eligible. Lots more to that, but the way in which they did it is part of what we want to talk about today. Like with most things, systems are set up to do certain things, to pay certain ways, to allow you to drive so fast on the highway or to bypass the operator on a call when you're trying to get customer service. But, there are ways around those things, and unfortunately that does happen. But part of what we saw happen in this case was that individuals were able to access information, use that information for fraudulent purposes in this case, and then subsequently bill services for individuals who were not eligible.
I have to throw the caveat in that right now we've got someone who has been charged but has not been convicted. The suspension was a temporary suspension of that company's payments. They have since made the decision to leave the state, and their operations actually ceased about 2 weeks ago. The payments have not been turned back on, but it's an unresolved matter. I want everybody to know that it's important that as we discuss this, we're not drawing any conclusions as to what the outcome of that criminal matter might be. It's very important. Something else I want to point out, these high-profile cases that everyone's read about in the paper, The one with the large behavioral health provider and one more actually dealt with money that they were receiving improperly from DHS. A lot of the other cases were what they did with money they did earn in a proper manner, but how they spent it later. And so we need to distinguish that. That's very important. We've got a few convictions in the case where they actually used their role here in the agency to get the money improperly. The other ones are plea agreements or allegations at this point. So I have to throw that out there so we don't wind up getting sued for some sort of slander or defamation. It's quite critical. But from this, what we've learned with for instance, the large behavioral health provider, access by a former employee into our system when they come knocking on our door after they've left, that's kind of what we've learned from that. You've got to be able to remember that when they're on the outside calling you for information, they may not have the best motives. That's what we've learned through this allegation that's being investigated. Always be careful. Remember, when you're wearing your DHS hat and somebody you used to work with is now on the outside, be very cautious about the information you share with them. Although much of what we have here is FOIable, that's not exactly, that's not how this information was obtained. So that's important to keep in mind.
Dawn, can you elaborate a little bit from the standpoint of an employee, right, that works here? Talk a little bit about what is alleged to have happened and what employees should, to follow up on what Jim's saying, what employees should be thinking about, because we haven't really described yet what is alleged to have happened that involves employees.
Certainly. So, and again, Jim touched on some of this, but in this case, what was alleged to happen is that a former employee was able to use knowledge both that they had from their time when they were with the agency, but also through communications with individuals who were with the agency at that point in time, to be able to try out different things in the system, if you will, to be able to say, well, if I submit something this way, will it pay? Or if it doesn't, why not? And, you know, many of us, whether we work in billing, whether we work in service providers, in direct care, there's always ways to get around the system. And sometimes those are okay in terms of something gets stuck, you know, dealing with eligibility, dealing with the payment, and we find a way through. And in many cases, that's okay. If it happens a lot, that's not okay, and we need to be asking ourselves why and further looking into that. In this situation, what we have seen, based on the information that's been presented, is that that is what appears to have happened, is that individuals were seeking information, finding out different routes of payment, what the system would and wouldn't do, and then using that to be able to then submit claims that they knew wouldn't pay otherwise unless they were actually submitted through a certain avenue versus another. And so with that, you know, and Jim touched on this a little bit, you know, it's important to think about what people are asking you when you're wearing your DHS hat, but an important reminder as well is we're all people, we all have families, we all have lives beyond the workday, but we still wear our DHS hat when we go home. So oftentimes, you know, a friend who used to work here, or may work here, may call you up and say, hey, can we get dinner? Can we have a drink? You know, that's all great. You need to be mindful of the timing of when you do some of those things, like if there's a procurement out or other things, legal action that may be occurring, but also being mindful of the conversations. You know, not everyone is necessarily looking to gain in an ill-gotten way from a conversation, but we have many former employees that go on and work for companies, for contractors, or consult, or do different things. And excuse me, just even getting knowledge to information that you may have in a passing conversation is inappropriate and could put this agency at risk, and more importantly, our clients and the taxpayers. So, you know, just always being mindful of if somebody's asking information, even if it's within the agency, you know, why is it they are asking? Do they have a need to know? And if you have questions about it, report it to your supervisor. Not in a way that you're trying to get somebody in trouble, but just in the way of trying to make sure somebody else knows and being able to keep track of, is this a practice? Is this something we need to be mindful of? Is this person constantly asking us this information? If so, why? And then be able to report that if we think that there may be, if that may be improper behavior.
Thank y'all. Kisa, there was a lot a few years ago, the court cases are, I think, sort of finally coming to a conclusion around some things that occurred in the nutrition program run by the Division of Child Care and Early Childhood Education. Can you talk a little bit about what occurred there and how all this came about?
Absolutely, and I see a lot of child care and early childhood education employees here, so a lot of you all in the room are familiar with what happened. And many of you that are watching and that are in the room are familiar because you've seen the stories. So you know that there were up to 16 individuals that were indicted for fraudulent activities under the food program. You'll know that these indictments and convictions were happening all the way up until this year still, and that the U.S. Attorney's Office had announced that they are still investigating and have asked individuals to still bring tips. But what you may not know is that some of these activities dated back, in terms of the origination, dated back to 2009. And that's when a group of really well-intentioned individuals, the governor's office, the Department of Agriculture, our agency, many of the programs in Central Arkansas that focus on feeding security, food security, got together and said, how do we make sure that our children in this state do not go home hungry? How do we ensure that when they're not in school that they're still getting fed properly? And so they recognized that our food program was something that was available, and that if we expanded it, that it would reach a greater population, and we would ensure that children wouldn't go hungry over the summer or when they were not in school and had access to school lunch. The problem is that there were a series of individuals that chose to take advantage of that and take advantage of it by either setting up fraudulent sites and saying that a site existed and that they were feeding individuals at that site when nothing actually existed there, or setting up a legitimate site and saying that they were feeding well more than they were actually feeding at that site, saying that they fed, hundreds of children when they may have fed 15 or 20 children. But I think the biggest thing that individuals don't know about what happened is that it wasn't the FBI, it wasn't the OIG that figured out what was happening. It was our staff that found out that the fraudulent activity was happening. What happened is that one day an invoice came in, and it was from a site in West Helena, and it was for $1 million. And so if you all are familiar with the population of West Helena, the question arose, how in the world did they serve enough children to invoice us $1 million? And what I'm excited and what I'm always glad to see about the employee that got that invoice is that they didn't just do their routine activity while saying, well, that's a little odd. I don't know how they serve that many people, and stamp it and push it along. They said, no, this can't be right. And they told their supervisor, who told their supervisor, who took it to Director Tanya Williams at that time, and immediately started an investigation. We immediately reached out to our federal partners, who were also looking at another case down in El Dorado, which started opening up all of these investigations. But it started with one person saying, okay, something's not right, and I'm gonna do something about it. And I think that's a significant thing for us to remember while we're going through our daily routines.
Jim, Kisa, do y'all have any particular lessons in addition to that one out of that example that you'd like employees to be thinking about?
I think you got it right. If something looks out of the ordinary, I think take a look at it, report it. Even if you're wrong, it's worth the chance that something that just really sticks out like a red flag. It's an outlier like that. Report it. I'm going to quote the Arkansas Code here. Your job here is a public trust, and that will go along with it. Your obligation to find things like that and report them and make sure that they get uncovered.
I would just piggyback to say, have the courage of your convictions. We don't typically think about that in terms of when we're doing our day-to-day job, but if you feel strongly that something is not in compliance with the work that we do, push it up the chain. and make sure that attention is being drawn to it, because again, that's the only way that we were able to handle this matter.
And in addition to pushing it up the chain, if for some reason you push it up and you don't feel satisfied that it's being handled, all right, we all know, and we don't have time to go into it today. We'll talk at another time about instances where literally up at this level of the organization, we've had people who are now serving time for having done things connected to work here. So we're not saying just push it up and ignore it. If you push it up and you don't feel like it's being handled, that's why we have created both a chief ethics officer. You can call or email Jim Brader. We have numerous places for you to report potential fraud or other activities, but we, as you know, we also now have you can email or call, but email DHS integrity it's integrity@dhs.arkansas.gov. They are investigating everything that they get. We're trying to have multiple ways because you have the day-to-day oversight, the day-to-day visibility into what's going on. So what we've literally talked about today are just a couple of things. The safeguards that are in the programs for a reason. So if someone is trying to get you to help them understand how do they get around eligibility issues? How do they get around billing issues? How do they make the system work because the safeguards are stopping them? Stop, as Kisa and Dawn have said, and Jim, stop and ask why. Why do they need to know that, right? And think about that before you give out that kind of information. And then second, because the safeguards are there for reasons. Secondarily, when you see something that raises questions in your mind, don't just let it pass through. Use your judgment with that, okay? These are very simple examples. I hope this has been helpful. We will try to do these as very short around different issues so that it doesn't take a lot of time. Feedback from this first one will be very welcome, as well as things that you'd like to hear about and understand more, because we really do want to have discussions around what you can do on a practical level to make sure the integrity of our operations stays strong. Thank you.